Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update. And as we continue to deliberate daily the various developments both in Israel and across the region, it's important to never forget that 145 days ago, on October 7th, the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a brutal massacre, murdering some 1,200 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping 246 people, including elderly men, women, children, and infants. 134 of them remain in Hamas captivity to date. Let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, out of the 134 hostages currently in captivity, 101 are believed to be still alive. What is ongoing currently in negotiations between Israel and Hamas? The United States obviously is leading those negotiations with Qatar and Egypt in the rooms. What can you tell us about that?
So, Jonathan, 101 hostages at most, unfortunately. The real number is probably down to 2 digits. And the deal is being negotiated between Israel and Hamas, but of course there are no direct negotiations between these parties. The negotiations are being held through mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, which also talks only to the mediators and not to Hamas. And even when the mediators talk to Hamas, they talk to the political office of Hamas in Doha, Qatar, and they have to go to their military wing, the Qassam brigades in Gaza, a very, very indirect route, and messages are oftentimes garbled on the way. So it's quite dicey to try and sum up what is happening. But what seems to be happening, especially following President Biden's expressed hope that by the end of the coming weekend, that is Sunday night, Monday morning, there will be at least the contours of a deal in which 40 Israeli hostages, that is slightly less than the total number of hostages still alive, will be released over the same number of days, 40 days, or approximately 6 weeks. And there are various categories of female civilians, female soldiers, the elderly, the sick and wounded. And in exchange for that, Israel will release hundreds, but not thousands, of Palestinian prisoners. It will re-release some 40 Palestinian prisoners who were earlier released in an earlier deal, but reverted to terrorism. They violated the agreement that they will retire from terrorism, if one ever retires from such a vocation. And the most important thing for Hamas, of course, is the ceasefire. Now, Hamas wants to portray itself as helping the population in Gaza, and therefore emphasizes the humanitarian aid, both through the Rafah crossing held by Egypt and in the northern part of Gaza held by and bordering Israel. However, as this is going on, there are still firefights in Gaza. The IDF has lost 2 brave officers, a company commander and a platoon leader, a major and a captain from the Givati brigade. And one feature which distinguishes the Israeli campaign in Gaza is the close air support. This has never been practiced to such an extent. And each squad, each platoon, whenever it encounters opposition and sees an ambush, can call in a fighter plane, a helicopter gunship, or a drone to pin down and destroy the enemy. This will obviously be studied in military schools and colleges for a long time.
Indeed, and we're closely observing it since it is quite impressive to see the ongoing air support in such a rapid response, considering the fact that it only takes several seconds for the various aircraft to react to the requests of the various forces on the ground, considering the fact and nature of the current combat scenarios taking place in the Gaza Strip, where the Islamist terror operatives pop up from different locations, launch a certain projectile or detonate a certain explosive device, and try to flee the scene. And in order to catch them in time, the forces on the ground, in many cases, just direct the aircraft in the direction of where they believe the same operative was fleeing to, and the air squads do the rest, which is quite impressive. But let's now turn to retired Colonel Joel Rayburn, formerly Senior Director of the National Security Council in Washington, the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, and currently the founding director of the American Center for Levant Studies. It's good to see you, Colonel. I'd like to ask you about the various intricacies of the current situation in the Gaza Strip. I've been studying, obviously, this war since the first day and tried to approach it from different angles, and it seems like this was an Iranian scheme. That's at least my conclusion to date. An Iranian scheme utilizing a non-Shiite proxy, which it's not really a proxy, it's supporting it, it's facilitating it, and it's granting it the tools to execute its terrorism against Israel. Nonetheless, it is not within the Rolodex, so to speak, of Iranian proxies, considering the fact that the Palestinian Islamic Jihad was taken as Iran's proxy in the first place. But nonetheless, one of the interesting aspects of this that the Iranians started to pressure different points throughout the Middle East, which are quite effective, so to speak. We're seeing the Lebanese front starting a low-intensity war vis-a-vis Israel since October 8th. We see the various attacks against U.S. forces in Syria and Iraq, as well as the Red Sea attacks or vigorous attacks against maritime shipping, which impact two of the lead negotiators in the talks currently, namely Qatar and Egypt. Qatar for its robust contracts of LNG, seaborne LNG that is then transited through the Red Sea, usually to Europe, in order to accommodate the transition from Russian dependency to other dependencies, and Egypt, of course, with the Suez Canal, its heavy reliance on seaborne transit through its waterways. And therefore, to what degree, when we look at the various challenges, are those factors taken into account?
Well, if I could touch briefly on the question of this sectarian difference between the Iranian regime and Hamas, this has never been an obstacle for the Iranian regime, for the IRGC in the past. It's continuously had clients, proxies that are not Shia. Even today, for example, I mean, Al-Qaeda is based in Iran today and is essentially allowed to use Iran as its operating base with the sponsorship of the Iranian regime, the IRGC. In the past, the Iranians hosted, armed, funded, trained, and helped to strategically direct some elements of the Taliban, especially in Western Afghanistan. So it's not an obstacle. The Iranian regime, and I mean, the Houthis are only nominally Shia. They're not 12 or Shia. They're a completely different doctrine of Shiism. This is, I think, sometimes you have observers who want to try to describe some sort of sectarian distinction between the Iranian regime and say that has some sort of implication. for the patron-client relationship between the Iranian regime and some of these militant groups. It's just not the case, historically speaking. And in fact, the Iranian regime has viewed some elements of the Muslim Brotherhood across the region as close allies in the past. So it's entirely in keeping with the Iranian practice to have a patronage relationship with Hamas. Sectarian difference doesn't enter into it, as long as it's an Islamist militant movement that can be steered in a direction that the Iranian regime believes is in its interest, even if occasionally that's against Shia populations, as it sometimes was in Iraq. So let me stop there. But if there are further strategic considerations, we can get into that as well.
All right. Mr. Owen, let's turn our attention to one of those proxies, namely Hezbollah, as we're currently seeing a low-intensity war seemingly intensifying. What can we see from there? We will, of course, dive deeper into this also in the next several days, but are we expected to see an all-out war at some point, or is diplomacy capable to de-escalate as the Biden administration currently aspires to do?
So let me take off where Joel just landed, on the same tarmac. The Iranians, regardless of whether they are under the Shah or under the supreme leader, have a very good view of themselves and a very low attitude towards all others. And for them, the Arabs are expendable. Of course, they would rather work through Muslims. They would rather work through Shiites within the Muslim world. And of course, when the revolution took place 45 years ago, they wanted to export it to wherever there are sympathetic centers, such as the Shiites in Lebanon. But having said that, they would rather have 100 Arabs die than a single Persian. And fortunately, I happened to visit Iran in the 1970s before they broke relations with Israel under Khomeini. And you could have heard this attitude towards the Arabs at the time. They did not change it. For them, the Arabs are useful. They don't care for them. And that also goes for Hezbollah, even though Hezbollah is the most significant, the most militarily capable of their arms in the Middle East and indeed in the world. If it comes down to Iran or Hezbollah, they prefer themselves. And they want to keep Hezbollah for a rainy day when the rain of Israeli bombs will come down on the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. So they do not want Hezbollah to escalate any further than the blows that they inflict on Israel. And they do inflict such blows on military installations and on civilian communities. But when push comes to shove, they would rather go back and have some arrangement, some formula to end this particular conflict and wait for a better day.
Well, proxies has been a Persian modus operandi since long ago, ancient times. Of course, Darius, and before that, they all utilized proxies, and time and again, they were surprised when those same proxies failed to deliver. And when the armies were at the gates of Persia, they always tended to fail miserably. So, history tends to repeat itself. But Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to ask you particularly about the discussions currently in Senate. There was an elaborate discussion, a hearing about the Red Sea. What can you tell us about that? And to what degree is the current administration taking serious the threat from Ansar Allah at a time when Vice Admiral Bradford Cooper, who formerly served as a commander of NAVCENT and the Fifth Fleet and currently is the deputy commander of Central Command, comes out and says we see the Iranian RGC advisors operating shoulder to shoulder with their Houthi counterparts and doing everything they can in order to facilitate those disruptions to commercial maritime shipping. And at the same time, when they asked him, okay, what should be done about this? Can the United States degrade the Houthis to the point of diminishing the threat to maritime shipping? And he said it's a matter of policy. Where is that policy right now?
It's very interesting, Jonathan. Thanks for mentioning the scene in Congress, because yesterday and today, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee is holding some significant hearings on yesterday the Houthi problem and the threat in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden, and today there will be another similar hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Iran's role in sponsoring militant proxies across the Middle East and what needs to be done about them. And you could see in the exchanges between the administration witnesses and the senators the outlines of the arguments and the sort of the differences of policy opinion that are taking shape in Washington. I think, for example, there is a bit of discontent among some senators over the legal authority under which President Biden and the administration have been carrying out formed the task force and the airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen, with the question of whether the president has the authority under the Constitution to extend the principle of self-defense to commercial vessels that aren't U.S. flagged. Now, this is a technicality, and it's not going to stop. It's not going to inhibit President Biden, but it's sort of a longer-term attitude, I think, in Congress that he has to take into account, or any president has to take into account. Then there was some questioning from Senator Tim Kaine, and you can see this coming through in some other members of Congress, saying, well, isn't the quickest way to end the Houthi threat to commercial shipping, just to do what the Houthis are claiming they want, which is to pressure Israel to stop its operations in Gaza and get to a permanent ceasefire, and then the Houthis should be taken at their word, and then that they're disrupting shipping for the sake of Gaza. That's another argument that's out there. I mean, it's quite naive. It doesn't match with the facts. The Houthis have been threatening shipping in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden for years and years before the Gaza crisis. But that's a school of thought that's still out there. And then I would say that there's at least a plurality among members of Congress, which sees the problem as the failure to deter the Iranian regime. And here we get down to the crux of the matter, and as you mentioned, and the implication that I think Admiral Cooper was making. And I'll go back to something that I've said repeatedly, which is that on the one hand, the Biden administration is now engaged in essentially warfare against the Iranian regime by proxy via the Houthis, via the Iraqi Shia militants across Iraq and Syria and some other places. But while being engaged in a warfare, they're not engaged in, say, money fair or economics warfare. There hasn't been a resumption of the really stringent sanctions and enforcement of those sanctions that we saw before 2021. And so I think, again, the crux of the matter now is that deterrence can't be achieved through sort of half military measures, especially when there aren't any other significant non-military tools being used. And sanctions is first and foremost. Political isolation would be another one. If the Biden administration wanted to get serious about isolating the Iranian regime, well, they would take great note and they would organize an international political coalition to act on, for example, the IAEA's assessment that the Iranians essentially are breaking all of their nuclear commitments under the IAEA. But in the absence of that, I think you strangely have a disproportionate use of sort of middle tier military means against the Houthis, not against their Iranian sponsors, and very little economic and political pressure. And that's the crux of the problem. And eventually, Washington is responding to this, and you can see the discontent with the current policy approach. But I would say, other than a resumption of the maximum pressure campaign, I don't think on the Democrat side you have a feasible alternative that's being put forward.
Well, recommending to or discussing the possibility of succumbing to Houthi demands, it makes me think about the fact that representatives, congressmen, and other politicians worldwide are as good as their worst advisors. And unfortunately, advisors these days are not as well informed as they should be in many circles. But nonetheless, Mr. Owen, the will or the intent to follow up on sanctions, since there was a statement by the Treasury about new sanctions against the RDC Quds Force and certain elements within also the Ansar Allah composite of the Houthi tribes and other tribes affiliated to it. Nevertheless, if they cannot fulfill the basic principles of truly establishing clear friction that would deter the enemy, how could they actually follow up on those sanctions themselves? It seems like intent is not there.
Well, I am not as nostalgic looking back towards the Trump-Pompeo era of maximum pressure, because there were so many loopholes, sometimes exploited by quote unquote allies and partners of the United States, such as India, not to mention China and Russia and others. And only recently there was quite an extensive New York Times story about how illicit oil is being shipped with the help of entities in the UAE and even in the United States itself. There are ways to go around sanctions. Not that the sanctions are not important, of course they are. And the one you mentioned, including personally the deputy head of the IRGC Quds Force, more power to the Treasury and State Departments when they are doing it. But enforcement is very difficult and takes time, years, resources. Turns out that private companies with business in the maritime domain are sometimes much more effective than governments. But it also speaks to the basic attitude of governments. And there you are right, the basic attitude of the Biden administration, as was the attitude of the Obama administration, where Biden was obviously number two. And by the way, Tim Kaine, whom Joel mentioned, was supposed to be Hillary Clinton's number two. Yes, they were more moderate in their outlook, and they tried an olive branch, which was not very effective either.
More moderate is one way to put it. Colonel Rayburn, I'd like to ask you, particularly since the European or EU member states, the UK for that matter as well, are clear-eyed about the rising toll that these Iranian-backed activities and directed activities, for that matter, are devastating. Many matters related to seaborne commodities that were supposed to arrive there. There are a lot of disruptions. LNG, as I mentioned, coming from Qatar, among others. And as such, they came to an understanding that they need to act, sending each country, a number of vessels are already seabound towards the Red Sea. Do you see here a correlation or a certain cooperation between Task Force 153 and the EU-led mission, as well as the various other missions that are conducted in self-defense, as you mentioned earlier, vis-a-vis the Houthis?
Well, not yet. And this was also a topic of yesterday's Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing, which is that the UK is participating in airstrikes. There are some other nations that are participating in support activities to U.S. and UK airstrikes, but really no one else. And so I think the question from some members of Congress is, well, what about the other countries? What about our allies in the region, our GCC allies in particular, and also the European countries? Why aren't they doing more against not just the Houthi threat, but against the Iranians that direct them? And it is the Iranian. This is an Iran problem. It's not really a Houthi problem. I very rarely disagree with our friend Amir. I have to disagree with him on the sanctions issue, and explain why he should be nostalgic for the maximum pressure era. Sanctions enforcement is really not hard. It's actually very, very simple, and the Trump administration from 2018 to the end of 2020 showed that. It's a concrete matter of keeping track of the vessels that are being used, of the financial institutions that are being used, of the Iranian central bank, of the Iranian state-owned companies that are exporting the oil and handling the transactions, and shutting those down and enforcing sanctions on anyone who does business with them. And this can be done, and it was done quite systematically, quite straightforwardly, and it had a devastating impact on Iranian regime cash flow and then currency reserves. By the end of 2020, they dwindled down to, by some estimates, under $5 billion in foreign currency reserves. Their currency was near collapse. They were probably weeks away from bankruptcy, and that would have forced them back to the table, I think, on the international community's terms for, if not just outright collapse. So I saw this work, Amir, and I think there's no need to overcomplicate it and overthink it. And this is precisely what the Biden administration is not doing right now. A sanction against the deputy commander of the Quds Force. Is he a billionaire? Is he moving money? Does he own a bank? No. So it's a meaningless sanction. The only sanction that matters is sanctioning Iranian regime oil sales and their ability to move money on a large scale. That's what the Trump administration focused on. Everything else is just virtue signaling to sanction, some guy who holds no money anywhere, as well as a Houthi counterpart, is absolutely meaningless. And it tells you that it's not serious. That's why I've been saying for months now that there has to be a return to serious economic pressure, and that means targeting Iranian regime oil sales. If that's done seriously by the United States, even the Chinese will respect that, as they did in 2020. They simply stopped buying significant amounts of Iranian oil, as did India, as did Japan, and so on.
Mr. Oren, 30 seconds. Where's Israel within this context?
Well, Israel is the silent partner, the invisible partner. And just like in the campaign against Daesh, ISIS, in Syria, where Israel had a lot of contribution through airstrikes, but was never a declaratory partner. In Yemen, too, without Israeli permission, there would have been no overflight of British jets from Cyprus to the Red Sea. And other support, too, which will go unmentioned here.
Last sentence, Colonel Rayburn.
Well, I would just say the guy who actually masterminded the enforcement scheme that I just talked about is actually testifying in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee today, former Iran Special Envoy Brian Hook. So I think that'll be an interesting hearing in the way he interacts with the senators again. Interesting times in Washington.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Colonel Joel Rayburn, Mr. Amir Oren, and to thank all of you at home as well. Until our next update from here in Jerusalem. Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel, and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.